Welcome to Leadership with Purpose. Today we are going deep into the leadership of a figure who, no doubt, shaped the modern business world, Jack Welch, a
Uh-huh.
former CEO of GE.
Right.
You've shared some fascinating insights into his methods, and it's a blend of disruption and a relentless focus on results. So our goal today is to unpack the core of his leadership philosophy and explore what might resonate with you as you think about effective leadership.
It's a name that, brings to mind a very specific style of leadership, direct,
Mm-hmm.
performance-driven,
Yeah.
and not afraid to challenge the status quo.
Hmm.
And looking at the materials you've provided, it's clear his approach is built on some very, very fundamental principles.
Okay, let's unpack this a little bit. And we can look at one of the cornerstones of Welch's leadership. And that's his strong belief in honesty and candor.
hmm
The materials you shared really emphasize this idea of radical candor. A commitment to telling people the truth directly, even when it's difficult.
And what's fascinating here
Yeah.
and is that, for this kind of radical candor to truly be effective,
Hmm.
it requires a foundation of significant trust within the organization.
Right.
Otherwise, directness can easily be misinterpreted as aggression. The sources allude to this delicate balance
Right.
in Welch's approach, and it's a crucial nuance to consider.
Yeah.
Um, a key manifestation of this belief in directness was his implementation of the differentiation system.
So the materials highlight how this was a very deliberate effort to recognize and reward top performers while also directly addressing underperformance. It wasn't necessarily about being harsh, but it was about creating a culture of open and honest assessment.
And even the challenging of ideas was encouraged from all levels of the organization.
Mm.
He believed that this free flow of honest feedback, regardless of someone's position, was essential for uncovering problems, sparking innovation, and ultimately achieving better outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
It's about creating that psychological safety where people feel empowered to speak their minds.
Now, moving from this principle of directness, another really significant aspect of Welch's philosophy was his intense focus on people.
Mm-hmm.
There's that famous quote,
Right.
"People aren't your most important asset. The right people are." It's a statement that on the surface might sound a bit cold, but the materials suggest there's a deeper meaning.
Precisely. It wasn't that Welch didn't value people.
Mhm.
In fact, the sources strongly emphasized the incredible importance he placed on carefully selecting
Right.
and then actively retaining those high-performing individuals. He fundamentally understood that the success of any organization is ultimately driven by having the right talent in the right roles.
And it wasn't just about finding them. He invested heavily in their development.
Yeah. Furthermore, the materials consistently point out his belief in truly empowering employees
Mm-hmm.
by granting them significant autonomy
Mm.
and real responsibility. He wanted those right people to have the space and the opportunity to excel.
This naturally leads us to what is perhaps one of the most talked about aspects of his approach to people management,
Right.
the differentiation system. Based on the materials, can you elaborate on how this system actually functioned?
Certainly. The sources explain that this system involved a regular categorization of employees
Mm-hmm.
based on their performance,
Mm.
typically into three distinct groups.
Okay.
The top performing 20%, the solid middle 70%, and the bottom performing 10%.
Mhm.
The core rationale behind this, according to the materials, was to very clearly identify
Mm-hmm.
the individuals who were making the biggest contributions and to reward them generously, while also identifying and decisively addressing the performance issues within that bottom 10%,
Right.
often leading to their dismissal.
So the fundamental idea was to really drive overall excellence within the organization by making those performance distinctions incredibly clear.
Exactly. The sources indicate that Welch firmly believed this level of clear differentiation was absolutely essential
Mm-hmm.
for cultivating a true high-performance culture. By visibly and significantly rewarding the top talent and taking decisive action regarding underperformance, his aim was to continuously raise the overall performance bar across the entire company. However, it's equally important to acknowledge, as the materials themselves do,
Right.
that this particular approach was not without its share of criticism and potential downsides.
Right. The materials do bring up the point that such a system could potentially foster
Yeah.
a very high pressure and intensely competitive internal environment. So while it might drive some to perform better,
Right.
it's understandable that it wouldn't necessarily be the right fit for every individual or every organizational culture.
That's a crucial consideration. While the primary intention was to elevate performance,
Mm-hmm.
the potential negative impact on overall employee morale and the level of collaboration and trust within teams is definitely something to weigh. It really highlights the inherent trade-offs that can exist
Mm-hmm.
within such a direct and intensely performance-driven management system.
Shifting our focus a bit now, the materials you provided also place a significant emphasis on Welch's strong advocacy for simplification and speed within the organization. And it seems that he had a real aversion to anything that smacked of bureaucracy.
Absolutely. The sources paint a clear picture of Welch as a leader who firmly believed that organizational agility
Yeah.
and the ability to make decisions quickly were critical competitive advantages in the fast-paced business world.
Mm-hmm.
He actively championed efforts to streamline internal processes and to eliminate any layers or procedures
Mm-hmm.
that he felt were slowing the organization down and hindering its responsiveness.
And this drive for speed wasn't just about reacting quickly to external changes, was it?
Right.
The materials also highlight that he actively encouraged employees to take calculated risks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about fostering a proactive mindset
Right.
throughout the organization
Mhm.
where employees felt empowered to take initiative
Mm-hmm.
and make timely decisions.
Mm.
Understanding that not every risk would necessarily result in a positive outcome. However, the underlying principle was that this bias towards speed and adaptability was absolutely crucial for the company to remain dynamic
Mm-hmm.
and competitive in a constantly evolving market.
Right.
This undoubtedly played a significant role in GE's ability to adapt to various market shifts over the years.
Another fundamental aspect of leadership, and one that the materials underscore in the context of Welch's tenure, is the critical importance of having a clear and compelling vision for the entire organization.
Yes. Having a really strong and easily understandable vision was absolutely paramount in Welch's leadership philosophy.
Mm.
The sources emphasize his fundamental belief in setting ambitious goals that truly challenged the existing status quo. He understood that without a clear sense of direction and aspirational targets to strive for,
Yeah.
it becomes incredibly difficult for any organization to achieve significant and lasting progress.
And it wasn't simply enough to have that compelling vision. There also needed to be a concrete plan in place
Right.
to actually achieve it. The materials really stress the significant importance he placed on developing a well-defined strategy, knowing not just where the company wanted to go, but having a clear roadmap for how it intended to achieve success.
Precisely. A vision without a well-articulated strategy is, as the saying goes, just a dream.
The materials you've shared also provide some really illustrative examples of Welch's leadership principles in practical application. The somewhat infamous nickname Neutron Jack from his earlier years at GE is certainly one that sticks in the mind.
It certainly does. And as the sources explain, this rather stark nickname emerged from his very aggressive early efforts to streamline GE's operations,
Right.
which unfortunately involved significant workforce reductions
Right.
and plant closures.
Yeah.
So it's a direct reflection of his intense focus on efficiency
Yeah.
and his clear willingness to make, very tough decisions to eliminate what he perceived as underperformance or unnecessary overhead, even if it meant, a substantial impact on the workforce.
And then we have rank and yank, which we've discussed in detail. But it's worth reiterating here as a very practical and consistently applied manifestation of that core differentiation system.
Right.
It wasn't just a theoretical concept.
Exactly. It wasn't simply an abstract framework
Mhm.
for thinking about performance. It's a very concrete and consistently implemented practice that had real and significant consequences for employees based on their regular performance rankings.
And of course, we can't overlook Crotonville, which we touched on earlier.
Yeah. It served as an absolutely crucial vehicle
Right.
for disseminating his specific ideas, for fostering a shared understanding of his leadership expectations across all levels of management,
Right.
and for actively developing the next generation of GE leaders who would operate in accordance with his particular business philosophy.
The materials also highlight the introduction and championing of Six Sigma, as a very data-driven methodology for achieving significant process improvement within GE under Welch's leadership.
Yeah, Six Sigma became a really integral part of GE's operational DNA. It provided a very structured
Right.
and highly data-driven approach to systematically improving efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
reducing defects,
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately driving significant bottom-line results.
And finally, there's the concept of boundarylessness.
Mhm.
Can you briefly explain what that entailed?
So boundarylessness, as Welch envisioned and promoted it,
Mm.
was fundamentally about breaking down the traditional silos and barriers that often exist within large organizations.
Mm.
It was about actively encouraging greater collaboration,
Mm-hmm.
more open communication, and the free sharing of valuable knowledge and best practices
Yeah.
across different departments. The ultimate goal was to create a more integrated overall organization.
So when we consider the bigger picture, painted by these materials, it's undeniable that Welch exerted a massive influence on the business world and left behind a truly significant legacy.
Absolutely. He transformed GE into an incredibly profitable and remarkably diverse global conglomerate. And his strong emphasis on maximizing shareholder value
Mm-hmm.
became, a very dominant paradigm in corporate America.
Yeah.
Furthermore, he popularized and mainstreamed several key management concepts and tools
Right.
that continue to be widely discussed and implemented
No.
in organizations around the world today.
But the sources also make it clear that his legacy isn't without its complexities. And there has certainly been criticisms leveled against his approach over the years.
That's an important point. The intense focus on short-term financial results and shareholder value has been questioned by some,
Mm-hmm.
with concerns raised about whether it potentially came at the expense of long-term sustainability
Right.
and broader stakeholder considerations. Additionally, while the rank and yank system undeniably drove performance in some areas,
Right.
it also raised significant concerns about overall employee well-being
Yeah.
and the potential for fostering a highly competitive and potentially cutthroat internal culture. His very direct
Hmm.
and often confrontational leadership style
Hmm.
was certainly not universally admired or embraced.
So as we begin to wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key lessons for leaders today that we can take away from studying Welch's approach?
I think the enduring relevance of candor
Mm-hmm.
is a really key takeaway. Even if the specific implementation of something like rank and yang,
Right.
might not be universally applicable or even advisable. And in today's very different work environments,
Right.
the fundamental importance of honest and direct communication in leadership
Mm-hmm.
remains absolutely crucial
Mm-hmm.
for building trust. Secondly, Welch's intense focus
Mm-hmm.
on identifying,
Mm-hmm.
developing,
Mm-hmm.
and retaining top talent,
Mm-hmm.
and on fostering a culture that supports growth and development.
What other key insights emerge from the materials?
The consistent drive for operational efficiency
Mm-hmm.
through the streamlining of processes and the fundamental need for strategic clarity.
Mm-hmm.
Having a well-defined and clearly communicated vision or also timeless principles that Walsh strongly championed.
Yeah.
And finally, strong results orientation
Mm-hmm.
and the establishment of a culture of accountability are vital for any organization
Yeah.
that is striving for sustained success.
So it seems that while some of Welch's more specific and perhaps more controversial methods might be debated or require careful adaptation for today's context,
Right.
the underlying principles of candor, a focus on talent, efficiency, strategic clarity, and a drive for results still hold significant value for leaders. It really encourages you to critically evaluate these principles and think carefully about how they might be relevant and applicable within your own leadership context.
Absolutely. It's not about blindly adopting everything that Welch did,
Eh.
but rather about taking the time to understand.
Well, this has been a truly insightful deep dive into the complex and impactful leadership philosophy of Jack Welch. Thank you for sharing your expertise and guiding us through these materials.
My pleasure.
And thank you, our listener, for joining us today on this exploration of leadership with purpose. We sincerely hope this deep dive into the principles that shaped Jack Welch's leadership has provided you with some valuable food for thought. Now, as we bring the session to a close, if you found this deep dive valuable and informative, please take a moment to like this content and subscribe to the channel. Your support really helps us continue to bring you these in-depth explorations of important leadership topics.
It truly does. Thank you so much for listening.